Stone giants once guarded the world's wealth. This was before banks, before any digital network. The lifeblood of empires moved on narrow desert trails, on dangerous sea lanes. And the only insurance policy that was strong enough was a wall of stone. We're going to look at 30 of these massive ancient fortifications. Each one is an engineering masterpiece. They were built to protect the most valuable trade routes in history, and by the end, you'll see the military genius behind them, the economic genius. You'll understand how they controlled the flow of things for centuries: silk, spice, gold. How could a single gatehouse in a desert hold entire economies hostage? And what hidden failures are buried under the most imposing walls? When you think of absolute power, what shape does that take in your mind? Trade drove civilization forward. But it wasn't just an exchange. It was this fragile, living network, these pathways. They were the arteries of the ancient world, the Silk Road, the incense route. The Amber Road, more than dirt trails across a desert, more than mountain passes, they were the channels. Everything of value moved through them, and I mean everything. Silk, yes, pepper, blocks of fragrant resin, but also something more powerful. Ideas, religious beliefs, whole technologies. A new way to make steel could travel from one empire to another. On the back of a camel, a philosophical text could change a kingdom's laws, delivered by a merchant just trying to sell cloth. That made these routes the ultimate prize. Controlling a narrow mountain pass, a single desert oasis, it wasn't just about collecting a toll, it was holding an empire's lifeline in your hands. You could set the price of luxury, dictate the spread of knowledge, the pace of progress itself. That created immense rivalry, bandits in the highlands. They saw a caravan as a moving treasury. Rival kingdoms watched a prosperous trade city with envy, with ambition. Vast nomadic confederations could sweep down from the steppes. Their mobility made them a constant threat, unpredictable. In that landscape, security wasn't a luxury. It was the foundation of wealth, so an arms race began. Not just in weapons, in walls. Protecting these streams of commerce sparked a revolution. Defensive architecture, the scale of a fortress, the thickness of a wall. The height of a watchtower. These weren't arbitrary numbers, they were a direct calculation, a reflection of the value flowing past the gates. That's the core idea. In the ancient world, trade and defense were two sides of the same coin. One couldn't exist without the other, that inseparable duality. It gave birth to the stone behemoths we're going to explore. And to understand their purpose, we start in a place where trade wasn't just about profit, it was about survival. The Hexi Corridor was this narrow strip of fertile land. It was squeezed between the deserts to the north and the mountains to the south. For anyone traveling east or west, any merchant caravan, any army, this was really the only path. And at its narrowest, most defensible point, they built a gatekeeper, a massive one. This was Jaiyuguan Pass. It was the western end of the Ming Dynasty's Great Wall. They called it the first and greatest pass under heaven, and that wasn't just a saying. Its design was all about controlling flow. The walls were enormous, trapezoidal. They were built from layers of tamped earth and then faced with brick, rising right out of the barren ground. But these weren't simple barriers, they formed a kind of maze. There was an outer wall, then an inner wall, and between them a killing ground. The gatehouses themselves were huge, less like doors and more like fortified cities. They were built to funnel all movement into one single choke point, one that could be easily watched. But the real genius wasn't just military. This was also where the Silk Road met Chinese bureaucracy. Every bale of silk, every sack of pepper, every bolt of cloth had to come through these gates. Imperial officials worked in customs houses inside the fortress walls. They calculated taxes, they stamped travel permits, They meticulously recorded the wealth of continents. The pass acted as a filter. It separated friend from foe. It separated taxable goods from contraband. It separated sanctioned travel from anything unauthorized. By building this colossal complex right where geography gave no other option, the Ming Empire did more than just defend a border. They placed a hand directly on the artery of Eurasian trade. They could squeeze it to raise revenue, or they could clamp down to cut off a rival. The stones of Jaiyuguan Pass tell a story of absolute control. They show that the most formidable walls are the ones people have no choice but to pass through. And this idea, using geography to command commerce, would show up again. In a startlingly similar way, on the opposite side of the ancient world, the Gobi Desert is silent, stone and sand. The wind moves through it, and in that emptiness there were walls. Sun-baked walls. That was Koto, the Black City, a fortress built as an island, an oasis. The Tangut people built it, the Western Xia dynasty. They built these huge earthen ramparts here because this place was a node. A point on a branch of the Silk Road. Caravans came through. They carried wool from the steppes, ceramics from the east, stones from distant mines. They all converged here. After weeks in the desert, those walls were a promise: safety, water, a place to trade, to rest. The city's design shows this. The outer walls were enormously thick. Layers of tamped earth and clay to withstand siege, to withstand the wind, and inside, at the center, a taller citadel, a fortress within a fortress. The final redoubt for the rulers, for the treasures. The layout funneled all commerce through fortified gates, so it could be watched, so it could be taxed. For centuries this worked. Koto thrived, a hub in a barren world, but that security had a fragile foundation. It didn't rely on geography like a mountain pass. It relied on the route, the trade. When trade flows, it brings life. It brings water because wells are maintained. It brings people to guard, merchants to fill the markets. But trade is a river, and rivers change course. Archaeologists see a slow, quiet end. Commerce began to shift. New routes opened. Power changed in distant capitals. The caravans grew fewer. The lifeblood of the city slowed, and with that, maintaining the water sources that probably became impossible. Those mighty walls, built to stop armies, were helpless against a subtler enemy. Economic abandonment. The city wasn't conquered in a siege. It emptied. Its purpose evaporated. The Black City was left to the sand, a monument to a truth. A fortification is only as strong as the reason for its existence. When the trade moved on, the greatest walls became a skeleton in the desert. That theme of dependence would be tested again. Not in the silence of sand, but in the fierce winds of the open steppe. The open steppe ended there. It wasn't the quiet emptiness of a desert city. It was the constant sound of a crossroads. To the west, the land climbs into the Caucasus highlands. But before you reach those mountains, you'd find a fortress, a different kind of fortress, the ancient place called Afrasiab. The place that came before Samarkand. It wasn't just a city, it was a vault. Its location was everything. It sat right where the main Silk Road split. A northern branch and a southern branch. Caravans came from Persia. They brought metalwork, religious texts. Traders came from China with silk and paper. Merchants from India with spices and gems. That convergence made it wealthy, unimaginably wealthy, and that wealth needed a shield of unimaginable strength. That shield was its walls. Historians and archaeologists describe something almost mythical. Cyclopean walls, that's the term. Massive, irregular stone blocks. Fitted together without mortar, some sections go back to the 6th century BCE. They weren't a single line, they were multiple rings, concentric rings. An outer wall for the sprawling city, an inner wall for the core districts, and at the heart, a citadel, a towering citadel that was defense in depth. The design anticipated a long fight. If an outer wall fell, defenders could pull back to the next one, turning the city into a layered trap. The goal was to outlast the armies from the plains. Nomadic armies, they were masters of the open field, but they didn't have the patience or the equipment, not for a long, grinding siege against a fortress like that. The walls of Afrasiab were a statement. They said, you can't take what's ours quickly, and time was the one thing the nomads never had enough of. That security created something inside. Because the walls held, the city became a permanent melting pot. Persian astronomy could meet Indian mathematics there. Inside those safe confines, Chinese silk weaving could be studied. Adapted, this wasn't just trade in goods, it was trade in thought, in art, in identity. The safety from those colossal stones allowed for a cultural synthesis. A synthesis that defined the region for 1,000 years. The later grandeur of Samarkand, the turquoise domes, the majestic madrasas that didn't come from nowhere. It was built on a foundation of security. Security laid down centuries earlier at Afrasiab. The walls guaranteed survival, but also the stable, prosperous conditions a golden age needs to bloom. They turned a vulnerable crossroads into an impregnable incubator, an incubator for civilization, and this pattern using formidable stone to protect a cultural nexus. That pattern would be tested again. In a landscape where the mountains themselves became the primary defense, mountains can have gaps, a narrow one between the sea and the cliffs. That place was Derbent. The Caspian gates, the Sasanian Empire saw this geography as a perfect problem. To the north, the Eurasian steppe, constant nomadic pressure. Armies could gather there and move with terrifying speed. To the south, their own rich, settled lands, and between them this one slender corridor, a strip just a few miles wide, the only practical route for any large group. A natural funnel, and the Sasanians decided to seal it. They didn't just build a wall, they built a geological extension, two massive parallel stone walls. They started in the shallows of the Caspian Sea, water lapping at the foundations. Then they ran west for miles, climbing the slopes, scaling ridges, until they merged with the stone of the Caucasus Mountains. Like stitching the mountains to the sea with a line of stone, and at the center of this barrier they placed a colossal citadel, the Naran Collar, perched on a hill overlooking everything. The walls, the sea, the narrow passage below. From there, commanders could see an approaching force days away. The design was pure strategic genius. It turned a geographical vulnerability into a defensive strength. Any army from the north faced a terrible choice. They could try to sail around, a dangerous and uncertain naval operation for steppe peoples, or they could throw themselves against miles of double walls under constant watch and artillery fire from the citadel above. Most chose to pay the toll because these walls weren't just a military barrier. They were the ultimate customs house. The Caspian gates regulated everything moving between Europe and Asia. Caravans with silver from Anatolia, fine textiles from Persia, amber from the Baltic, all of it had to pass through the controlled gates in that wall. The empire could tax it, monitor it, or deny it passage entirely. This control brought immense wealth and security for centuries. It showed that the most powerful fortification isn't the one that just stops an enemy. It's the one that forces the world to move on your terms, that channels all movement, all ambition, all commerce through a point you completely command. The stones of Derbent are a lesson in leverage. They prove the greatest defense is sometimes built not to surround something precious, but to block a path everyone else needs. Anacopia was a fortress up on the Iberian mountain, looking out over the Black Sea. It wasn't a wall across a plain, it was a sentinel on a cliff. Its position was the weapon. From that height, a lookout could see for miles across the water. They could watch for sails. More than that, it controlled the narrow strip of land below. That coastal route was the connection. It snaked along the shore, linking the Caucasus region to the Byzantine Empire. Whoever held Anacopia held the key to that corridor. A choke point for sea and land, a double advantage from nature seized by engineers. The design was efficient defense, not a single wall but a series of tiers ascending. Attackers scaling the lower defenses would face another wall higher up, defenders above them raining projectiles down. At the heart, a fortified cistern. It collected rainwater, so a small garrison, maybe a few hundred, could hold out for months. They didn't need a vast army, they had the mountain. That's leveraged defense. Using the unchangeable geography, the cliff, the steep approach, the view as a force multiplier. One soldier on that wall was worth 10 on the field below. And what they were protecting was the trade. The lifeblood of the region flowed past their feet. Ships carried timber from the Caucasian forests, vital for construction across the Byzantine world. Caravans brought honey and wax from inland, commodities as valuable as spices in an age before electric light. Anacopia made sure those goods moved safely, and that the power controlling the fortress profited from their passage. It shows a truth. It wasn't only the grand continental Silk Road that needed colossal stone guardians. Regional routes did too, routes dealing in what we might call humble goods. They required the same formidable investment. The security of commerce at any scale was the foundation of power. From the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the pattern repeated. Find the narrow point, build the unassailable wall, command the flow of all that moves. This pursuit of control through stone would lead to one of history's most iconic defensive lines, born from a very specific, enduring fear. The fear of nomadic raids would eventually lead to a wall being built across a continent. But before that, there was another kind of wealth to protect, not silk, scent. The air had value. In the deserts of southern Arabia, frankincense and myrrh trees produced a resin. These fragrant drops were worth more than gold by weight in the ancient world. Their path north was called the incense route, a river of perfume moving through sand. And where that route passed through a narrow gorge of red stone, a city was carved to control it. That was Petra. Its main defense wasn't a wall you could construct. It was a wall the earth had already provided. The Sick, a winding, slender canyon, in places just 10 feet wide, with cliffs rising hundreds of feet on either side. For any caravan, this was the only way in, a natural kill box, silent, imposing. An army could be destroyed here not by soldiers but by the terrain itself. The Nabateans who ruled Petra understood this. They didn't just live in the canyon, they weaponized it. They carved water channels into the walls to control the flow. They built dams for floods. They placed lookouts on the high cliffs. The city, when it appeared at the end of the Sick, was a fortress disguised as buildings. The famous treasury, that beautiful facade, was more than a tomb. Its upper levels were a fortified platform. The mountains around it were full of caves and tunnels and hidden passages. These were escape routes, storage, ambush positions. The whole city was designed for a siege. Their most brilliant defense was against thirst. In that dry place, an army could surround you, but they couldn't stop the rain. The Nabateans built a system of cisterns and channels and reservoirs to catch every drop. They could hold out for months, even years, while an invading force dried up in the desert sun. This was passive defense, sophisticated. Petra didn't need tall battlements. Its power was subtler, woven into the stone and the management of water. It made the city nearly unconquerable, not by force but by resilience. And what were they guarding? The source of their enormous wealth. Every caravan carrying frankincense, headed for temples and palaces from Rome to Persia, had to pass through their territory. The Nabateans taxed it, controlled its price, grew powerful. They were middlemen, but middlemen living in an impregnable vault. Petra shows a different kind of military genius. One that listens to the land and amplifies its natural defenses. it raises a question. Is the greatest fortress the one that dares you to attack its walls, or the one that makes an attack seem utterly futile? This idea of integrated environmental defense would find a clear contrast in another desert kingdom, one that chose a different answer, building not with the landscape but in spite of it. The air in the desert carried the weight of wealth, not the smell of money but of sacred smoke. Far south of Petra there was another fortress city. It guarded the source. This was Shabwa, the capital of the Hadramaut kingdom. It didn't sit in a dramatic canyon. It rose from the dry plains in what's now Yemen, a deliberate stronghold in open land. Its power came from what it held. This was where the frankincense trees grew, the actual source of the incense route, and to protect that source they built layers. Ancient writers said Shabwa had not one wall, not two, but seven rings of defense, a city like a stone onion. Each layer you peel back reveals another, harder barrier. This was a calculated response. The resin harvested here was so valuable, so wanted by distant empires, that the city had to become a vault. The outer walls protected the outskirts, the people. The inner walls shielded the palace, the administrative heart, and at the very core, the most fortified space probably guarded the warehouses, the storehouses where frankincense was graded and weighed and stored before its journey north. Every caravan leaving Shabwa carried a fortune, and every wall was a message to the desert, to rival tribes, to ambitious neighbors, to any bandit army. The message was simple: the cost of taking what's here is more than you can pay. You'd have to fight through not one battle, but 7 separate sieges. The design created time. If an outer wall was breached, defenders could fall back to the next one, and the next, bleeding an attacker dry across miles of stone. This made Shabwa less a city and more a fortified bank, a secure depository for a commodity that funded kingdoms. Its primary function was storage and taxation. Control the source, control the quality, control the price. By making the city nearly impossible to sack, the rulers guaranteed the sweet smoke would flow on their terms alone. The story of Shabwa, of its 7 walls, brings the incense route into focus. It shows the guardians of trade didn't just protect the path. They protected the point of origin with obsessive, layered security. Because when your wealth literally grows on trees, you build walls around the orchard, and this world of land caravans and desert fortresses was only half the story. An equal amount of treasure and peril moved on a different kind of road, one with no roads at all. The sea was like a desert with no landmarks. For Tyre, that sea wasn't a barrier, it was a moat. They built their city on an island just off the coast, and they turned that island into a vault. The first defense was the water. An enemy fleet had to cross open sea to get there, and when they arrived, they saw walls, not normal walls. These were colossal sea walls. They rose straight up from the water, made from huge stone blocks fitted together so tightly the waves couldn't get a grip. They were sheer, they were smooth. They were incredibly high. From a ship, you'd be looking up at a cliff of stone. There were no beaches, no gentle slopes, just this impossible vertical face. That made a direct naval assault a kind of suicide. You couldn't ram the walls with a ship. You couldn't easily scale them from a rocking boat. The walls made the island a floating fortress. But Tyre's genius was in layers. They didn't just rely on stone. Behind those walls was one of the ancient Mediterranean's most powerful navies, a fleet of fast warships. They could patrol the waters, they could intercept threats before they reached the walls, or they could launch sudden attacks on any force trying to set up on the mainland. This combination created a defensive zone. The navy controlled the sea approaches. The walls made the city untouchable. It was a perfect system for a society whose wealth came from trade. And inside those walls was the source of that wealth. Tyre was famous for its purple dye, made from sea snails in big, smelly workshops, An ounce of that purple was worth more than its weight in silver. It colored the robes of emperors. The city was also a center for glassmaking. They made clear glass and intricate vessels, and it was the main port for cedar wood from Lebanon. The strongest timber for ships. All of this industry, all this treasure was safe behind that double shield, wood and stone. The ultimate testament to Tyre's strength came from Alexander the Great. When he marched down the coast, city after city surrendered, but Tyre refused. They felt secure on their island. Alexander's response was to build a causeway. A massive mole of stone and rubble from the mainland out to the island. He moved a mountain into the sea to turn Tyre's greatest strength, the water, into a weakness. The siege took 7 months. It was brutal, but it proved that even the most perfect defense has a limit if an enemy is willing to pay an unimaginable price. Alexander's causeway is still there. It turned the island of Tyre into a peninsula, and that transformation is a lesson. It shows that the value of a fortress is always measured against the determination of those who want what's inside. The Phoenician model of sea and stone defense didn't vanish. It became a blueprint adopted and refined by a new power in the same waters. A power that understood to control trade, you first had to command the waves. The confidence of a city is measured by the size of its stones. Rhodes used enormous ones. The walls around the main city were a masterpiece of Hellenistic military engineering. They were designed to repel an attack and to make the idea of an attack seem foolish. The blocks were so massive, so perfectly fitted together, that from a distance the fortification looked like a single cliff face, a cliff carved by giants. And these weren't simple vertical walls. The design had angular bastions. They projected out from the main line. That geometry meant any force approaching one section would be exposed to defensive fire from 2, even 3 directions. There were deep, dry moats in front of the walls, another lethal layer to cross under a hail of arrows and stones. This system existed for one primary reason: to protect an economic engine. Rhodes sat at a crossroads, ships from Egypt carrying grain, ships from Asia Minor with wine, ships from the wider Greek world with crafted luxuries. They all converged on its twin harbors. The walls guaranteed that this flow of wealth was never interrupted. They made the city a safe deposit box for Mediterranean commerce. And watching over it all was the Acropolis. This wasn't a cramped fortress. It was a spacious, fortified hilltop complex, set back from the city proper, giving defenders a panoramic view of the sea approaches. From here, lookouts could spot sails on the horizon hours before they reached port. Signals could be relayed, the navy mobilized, the city gates secured. The Acropolis was the brain of the defensive system, a command center that used elevation as its primary weapon. This entire apparatus was famously tested. Demetrius Poliorcetes arrived, a master of siege warfare with an enormous fleet and an army. He brought the latest technology, a colossal siege tower on a ship. For a year, he threw everything at the walls of Rhodes, and for a year the walls held. The angled bastions broke the force of his assaults. The height of the defenses neutralized his engines. The city's ability to resupply by sea, protected by its own fleet, meant the siege could not starve them out. In the end, Demetrius gave up. He left behind most of his abandoned siege equipment. The Rhodians sold it. They used the funds to build a monument. That monument was the Colossus. It likely did not straddle the harbor entrance as the legends claimed. But its existence was a statement, a symbol forged from the scrap metal of a failed invasion, a towering figure that said the city's wealth and safety were indivisible. Protected by stone, by ingenuity, by an unbreakable will, this blend of economic might and defensive genius wasn't unique to the Greek world. A similar formula for power was being perfected elsewhere, with even grander ambition, by an empire that viewed the entire Mediterranean as its own protected trade route. Syracuse had a shadow that stretched for miles. Its walls ran more than 27 kilometers. They were a stone embrace, and inside them was the city and the two deep water harbors. This wasn't a wall for a mountain pass. It was a wall built to contain an empire. The architect was Dionysius the Elder. He believed security was the first investment, so he took the city's immense wealth and poured it into stone. He built a defensive loop that made all of Syracuse into a fortress. That wealth came from the richest soil in the Mediterranean, Sicilian grain, ships from Athens, from Corinth, from across the Greek world. They all came to fill their holds. Controlling that trade made Syracuse phenomenally rich, and that wealth went right back into the walls. It was a perfect cycle. Prosperity paid for security, and security guaranteed more prosperity. The walls themselves were a masterpiece of forward thinking. They weren't just a tall barrier, they were a multi-layered system. Built into their length were platforms for the latest artillery catapults that could hurl heavy stones at any approaching fleet. Then there were the sally ports. These were small, hidden gates fortified from the inside. During a siege, troops could burst out from these ports. They could launch a swift counterattack on the besiegers' flanks, then retreat back behind the walls before a proper response could be organized. It turned a defensive posture into an occasional offensive strike that created a unique psychological reality. For the people of Syracuse, the walls were a constant, reassuring presence. They meant life within could proceed with confidence. The bustling markets, the shipbuilding yards, the grain warehouses. The city wasn't just defending a treasure. It was defending a way of life, an entire economic ecosystem. The walls made the city-state a self-contained world, secure enough to project power across the sea. This model of an encircling, all-encompassing defense stands in contrast to what was being built elsewhere. Not every empire sought to protect a single, glorious city. Some needed to guard something far more linear and infinitely more fragile, a single, vital road stretching across the top of the known world. Rome saw a border as something alive. Not just a line, a system, a network of watchful eyes and swift reactions. They built this idea into stone and rode across a huge desert frontier, the Limes Arabicus. A defensive web that ran for hundreds of miles along what's now Jordan. It was there to guard a stream of scent and spice, the incense route which was flowing into the heart of Rome. But the threat here wasn't an army. It was the swift, unpredictable raid. Nomadic tribes could appear from the emptiness, strike a caravan, and vanish back into the dunes before any legion could march from its distant base. Static walls, like city walls, were useless. The desert was too wide, so Rome built a different kind of shield, one made of information and speed. They dotted the barren landscape with a chain of small, sturdy forts. Forts like Casa Bishur, these weren't big legionary fortresses. They were compact, square strongholds built for cavalry. Each one housed a unit of mounted soldiers. Their horses were the key. From these isolated outposts, patrols could ride out on cleared, maintained roads. They could cover vast distances, showing the flag and gathering intelligence. But the real genius was in the connections. Between these forts, spaced a day's march apart, stood watchtowers, simple stone towers on high ground. From there, a single soldier could scan the horizon. If he saw dust rising, the sign of a moving group, he could signal. Using mirrors by day or fires by night, a message could leap from tower to tower, fort to fort, far faster than any horse could run. An early warning system built of light and flame, so a caravan under attack didn't have to wait for help from a city weeks away. A cavalry unit from the nearest fort could be saddled and riding within minutes of the signal. The system changed the frontier from a passive barrier into an active, intelligent membrane. It filtered out raiders while letting peaceful trade flow. The forts themselves were hubs of security. Caravans could rest inside their walls, their precious cargo of frankincense and myrrh safe for the night. The Roman state guaranteed that safety and taxed the goods. The lime's Arabicus was less a wall and more a managed ecosystem. It showed how defense could be a matter of logistics and communication, not just brute masonry. Protecting a trade route wasn't about building a single impenetrable gate. It was about ensuring that for every mile of vulnerable road, there was an answer within reach. This idea of a responsive, integrated border became a blueprint, and it would be pushed to its limit on the far northern edge of another empire, where the trade wasn't in perfume but in fur and amber. Dura Europos was built right at the edge of the desert where it meets the Euphrates River, a place between worlds. Its walls came up from the plain on the west bank. They were more than a boundary, they were a filter. This was a Roman garrison looking out at the Parthian Empire. Every caravan moving between those powers had to go past its gates. Bringing textiles and spices on the river or on the land routes alongside it. Controlling that traffic was the whole point of the city, and the walls were how they did it. You can see adaptation in those walls. The Greeks founded it after Alexander, then the Romans took it over. The stonework shows the layers. The original Greek design had strong, square towers. The Romans added to it. They made the ramparts thicker. They built new towers that projected out so defenders could shoot along the wall's face. This wasn't just theory. It was military evolution built by engineers who knew the threats. The archaeology at Dura Europos is stark. It's a time capsule. In the 3rd century, the city faced a final, huge assault. The evidence was buried in the sand. They found a mine tunnel dug by attackers to collapse the walls, and right beside it, a countermine dug by the Romans. In that dark space, they found the remains of a final fight. This is physical proof. The towers had a purpose. The thick walls were a practical necessity. They were the stage for a desperate battle. The whole defensive system was tested in the most real way. That position made the city rich. A customs house inside processed goods, collecting taxes for Rome. The security from those walls allowed for a real cultural mix. Temples to Greek gods were near a synagogue with murals and an early Christian church. That diversity happened because the walls were a shield. They made a space where traditions could meet and trade, safe from the chaos outside. But the shield broke in the end. The pressure from the east was too much. The city fell, was abandoned, and the desert buried it. Dura Europos shows you a relentless truth about these frontier posts. However strong the walls, however clever the adaptations, they were under constant strain. They were the front line in a perpetual contest for control of wealth. When one city fell, the trade didn't stop. The contest just moved. The lines were redrawn. That same exhausting pressure, the struggle to secure rich commerce against rivals, was happening somewhere else entirely. On another continent, along trails where the wealth wasn't silk or spice, it was salt and gold. Gold and ivory moved from the interior toward the coast. But there was a city in between, a city of stone on a hill, Great Zimbabwe. It was a fortress, but not the kind you'd expect. It wasn't on a border. It was inland, right at the center of everything. Its walls were made of granite blocks, cut so precisely they needed no mortar. They formed these enclosures winding across the landscape. The biggest one, the Great Enclosure, is an elliptical wall, over 30 feet high in places, and that wall, that grandeur, it wasn't really about defense. Not in the usual sense. It was about creating a sanctuary, a secure space for the kingdom's elite and for its wealth. Inside, the ruler and the priests could perform the rituals. The rituals that blessed the trade, and they could store the gold dust, the raw ivory, the lifeblood of the kingdom. The location made a statement. It was built high on a hill overlooking the plains. Overlooking all the trade routes. From up there, sentries could watch everything, the movement of goods, of people, for miles. The security was about control. Oversight, not about withstanding a siege. The real message was in the stonework, the sheer scale of it. For the Swahili merchants coming from the coast, those walls were a guarantee. A physical promise. They signaled a kingdom of power, stability, permanence. They said the rulers here were reliable. They could protect the caravans. Enforce agreements, produce a steady flow of goods. The walls were a brand built in stone, so the authority was dual. Great Zimbabwe was an economic hub. And a spiritual one. The same walls that secured material treasure also enclosed sacred spaces that linked the king's power to the divine, to the ancestors. Prosperity and protection were seen as gifts from the spiritual realm. The architecture made that connection tangible. This fusion of commercial and political and religious power in one fortified center, it mirrors other places. Afrasiab, Shabwa, it points to a principle. When trade is the foundation of a kingdom, its greatest monument will be the fortress that protects that foundation. Physically and symbolically, the ruins of Zimbabwe make you reconsider a wall. Is its main job to keep enemies out, or to project an image of such strength that enemies don't even try? That question of projection, of architecture as a psychological weapon, it would be taken to an extreme somewhere else, far to the north, where an empire built walls not just around a city, but across the roof of the world. Stone met the sea again, but this time the architects came from across an ocean. The Portuguese arrived on the Swahili coast. Their goal was singular: to command the Indian Ocean trade, a network far older than their own kingdom. They found cities built from coral stone, cities thriving from centuries of commerce. Gold, ivory, spices, and to secure their piece of it, they built in a new shape, the shape of a star. Fort Jesus in Mombasa is the starkest example. Its design was a geometric answer, an answer to a new kind of warfare. The age of cannon had arrived. Tall, straight medieval walls were vulnerable now. They could be shattered by concentrated artillery fire. So Renaissance military engineers developed the bastion. These were angular projections from the main wall. From above, the fort looked like a stone starfish gripping the coast. Every angle was calculated. Each bastion gave a clear line of fire along the face of the wall next to it. There was no blind spot. An attacker approaching any point would be exposed to crossfire from multiple directions. The fort was a lethal, three-dimensional puzzle. But its purpose was economic, not just military. It was built directly overlooking the narrow entrance to Mombasa's harbor. Every ship laden with pepper from India, or cloves from Zanzibar, or gold from the interior had to sail within range of its guns. Control that point, and you control the wealth of a continent. The Portuguese weren't the first to see the value of this spot. The site had likely been a defensive position for the Swahili city-states long before. The fort was simply the latest layer, the most technologically advanced layer in a perpetual struggle for that port. Its thick walls enclosed more than barracks and armories. They enclosed a system of control, customs houses, warehouses, a secure base from which to patrol the coast, to enforce trade agreements that favored Lisbon. This was the ancient logic of Derbent or Tyre, updated for the age of gunpowder. Find the choke point, build the ultimate stronghold, command all that moves. The story of Fort Jesus is a reminder. The principles of trade fortification never became obsolete. They evolved. The threats changed from nomadic cavalry to rival European fleets. The tools changed from arrows to cannonballs, but the core objective remained constant: to use engineered stone to guarantee profit, to guarantee power. This relentless adaptation wasn't confined to the Old World. As European empires looked west, they carried this same strategic playbook to new shores, where they would confront not rival kingdoms but a vast, uncharted landscape and its own ancient networks of exchange. The stones in the Andes seem to almost float. There's a fortress, Sacsayhuamán, up on a ridge above Cusco. Its walls aren't straight, they're like a series of teeth, jagged, saw-toothed lines zigzagging across the ground. Each one of those teeth is a bastion, and they're built from stones that feel impossible. Some are taller than a person, many weigh over 100 tons. They aren't rough either, they're carved with a precision that still surprises engineers. These are polygonal stones with all these angles and facets. They fit together without any mortar, so tightly you can't even push a blade of grass between them. That technique, ashlar masonry, it did more than make a smooth wall. It made the wall flexible. When earthquakes hit, these interlocking stones would shift, they'd settle, then lock back into place. A straight, static wall would have fallen. This wall just trembled and stood. From those high, zigzag ramparts, defenders had every advantage. An army attacking one of the projecting points would be caught from 3 sides. Arrows, sling stones, spears, all coming from multiple angles. The design turned the high ground into a lethal weapon, but Sacsayhuamán was more than a fortress. Like Great Zimbabwe, it had a dual purpose. It was a ceremonial center for rituals tied to the sun and the seasons, and its deep, secure chambers probably held the empire's vital treasures. Not just gold, the practical wealth that fueled the state, exquisite alpaca wool textiles which were art and currency, stores of coca leaves for rituals and for messengers, reserves of tools and metals. It was the secure vault for the capital's entire economy, and that economy depended completely on the road, the Cyclopean, the Inca highway. A network of paved trails, stairways, suspension bridges, stretching for thousands of miles. It connected the coast to the highlands, the rainforest to the desert. And along it, a constant flow of goods, moved not by wheel but by thousands of relay runners and llama caravans. Cusco sat at the very heart of this web. Every thread led back to the capital. Sacsayhuamán, looming above, was the guardian of that nexus. Its main role was to protect that administrative and economic heart. The place from which all those roads, all that trade, was controlled. A rebellion far away could be met with troops moving fast along the roads, but a strike at Cusco itself would cripple everything. The fortress was the ultimate insurance. Its existence makes a point. Here, on a continent separated by oceans, the same strategic principle emerged. Where immense value concentrates, immense protection follows. The form was different, zigzagging megaliths instead of straight walls or star-shaped bastions. But the function was identical: to use monumental architecture to secure the flow of wealth and power. This echo in stone suggests something fundamental. When trade becomes the lifeblood of an empire, fortresses aren't an option. They're a physiological necessity, a necessary shell grown to protect a vital organ. And the design of that shell is always a direct response to the threat. For the Inca, the threat was often internal rebellion. Their solution was a stone puzzle on a mountaintop. Watching over the roads that held everything together, this pattern of inland fortresses guarding internal trade networks would find a counterpart. In a place where the roads weren't paved with stone but carved by rivers through endless jungle, the jungle canopy hides more than ruins. It hides entire landscapes of war. For a long time, the Maya were thought of as peaceful. Astronomer priests in open cities with no defenses. That idea is gone now, completely overturned. Not from one discovery, but from a new way of seeing. LiDAR, lasers from the air that strip away the vegetation to show the ground, and what it's shown across the Maya lowlands is a shock. A hidden geography of conflict, extensive earthworks, deep ditches, raised berms, remnants of wooden walls that once stood tall. These weren't small fences. They were massive defensive systems stretching for miles sometimes, and they didn't just surround the big plazas and pyramids like at Tikal. They encircled something more vital. The farmlands, the agricultural hinterlands that fed everyone, the routes that brought in critical goods. This changes everything. it proves these weren't just ceremonial hubs. They were fortified citadels locked in a constant struggle, a struggle for survival and supremacy. What were they protecting? The lifeblood of their economics. Jade from the Matogwa River Valley, carved into symbols of power. Obsidian from the highlands, the sharpest material for tools and weapons. And the green feathers of the Quetzal bird, more valuable than gold for the headdresses of kings. These things moved on jungle trails and rivers. Controlling a key stretch of that network meant controlling wealth, status, divine authority. The fortifications were the tools of that control. They weren't always built of enduring stone. In the humid tropics, wood and earth were practical, but their scale was monumental. They integrated the environment into the defense. A swamp became a moat, a steep ridge became a rampart. Maya engineers sculpted the land, turning natural features into impassable barriers, barriers that funneled all movement toward a single, guarded gate. This reveals a period they call the Maya Star Wars, an era of intense, chronic warfare between rival city-states. Kings rose and fell on their ability to secure resources. To protect the flow of trade, a successful raid capturing a shipment of jade could shift the balance of power. The defensive earthworks were a direct response. They made the countryside a fortress. They let a city safeguard its food supply and its trade access, even under pressure. It's the same fundamental logic we saw at Sacsayhuamán or Shabwa. When what you need to survive must come from beyond your walls, you build walls around the paths that bring it. The silent earthworks of Tikal deliver a lesson. The drive to secure trade and resources is a universal catalyst for military engineering, in the desert, on the steppe, in the mountains, and as we now know, deep in the heart of the rainforest. No environment is so remote, no culture so focused on the celestial, that it's immune to the earthly need for defended commerce. This pattern, inland fortification guarding the arteries of an economy, finds a stark contrast on a different continent. Where the trade wasn't in feathers or stone, but in human lives. The search for spice redrew the world, and by the 17th century that search reached Indonesia. The air smelled different there, sharp and warm from cloves drying in the sun. This was the source, the islands where the spices grew. To control it, the Dutch East India Company built a fortress of pure force. Fort Rotterdam, they didn't pick empty land. They chose a place that already had power, the city of Makassar, a trading port for centuries with its own rulers and its own forts. The Dutch tore down the Makassar's fort and built theirs on top of it, a replacement in every sense. Their new fort was a stark shape against the tropics. A rectangle of high stone walls with 5 huge bastions at the corners. These weren't just towers, they were angular projections built from the latest military science. From above, the fort looked like a stone arrowhead aimed at the sea. Each bastion gave a clear field of fire, overlapping fields. Cannons placed there could sweep the approaches to the walls. A crossfire no army or fleet could enter safely. The engineering had a dual purpose. The thick walls and bastions faced the land to stop any local uprising or rival European power. But the cannons also faced the harbor. They commanded the sea lanes. Any ship trying to run a blockade or trade outside the company's monopoly was under their threat. This was the Crac des Chevaliers of the Sea, a crusader castle for commerce. Its whole reason was to enforce one brutal economic rule. All cloves and nutmeg from these islands would be sold only to the Dutch East India Company. At the company's price, native growers were forbidden from selling to anyone else. Fort Rotterdam made that rule a physical law. Its guns guaranteed it. Inside those secure walls, VOC officials weighed the harvest. They graded it. They packed it into the holds of their ships for the long, profitable voyage back to Europe. The fortress was a secure factory, a customs house, and a prison for economic policy, all in one imposing complex. This is the early modern peak of an ancient idea. Using the most advanced defensive technology of the time to seize a trade node, the principles were the same as at Derbent or Tyre. Find the choke point, the source of wealth. Build an unassailable stronghold there, but the technology was new, the bastion, the cannon. The ambition, though, was ancient, and this model of fortified trade control didn't start with European ships. Its roots are older. They lie in the very region the Dutch had sailed through to get there. The Indian subcontinent had perfected this art of protected commerce long before. The cliffs at Gwalior, they rise up out of the plains like a stone island. It wasn't a border fortress, it was in the middle of everything, a solitary mesa right on the land routes. The ones that crisscrossed central India for centuries. Any caravan, moving textiles, indigo, opium later, they all had to pass within its shadow, and that shadow had a price. The natural defense was almost perfect, steep, rocky slopes on every side. A direct assault would have been suicide, but then human hands made it absolute. They carved a labyrinth of defenses up the only approaches. The entry sequence was a lesson in controlled chaos. You'd approach a massive gate, the Hathai Pol, the Elephant Gate. But passing through didn't put you inside, it put you in a trap. The path beyond made a series of sharp, 90-degree turns. You'd be funneled into narrow, walled corridors. And from above, on the ramparts, defenders could rain down anything, stones, boiling liquid, arrows, on an army that was now compressed, disorganized. Moving at a crawl, each gate was a killing zone, designed to slow, to confuse, to decimate. Defense as a brutal, efficient process. The fort changed hands with startling frequency. Rajputs, Mughals, Marathas, the British, every major power fought to hold it. That relentless turnover is the clearest proof of its value. It wasn't just a castle. It was a toll house, a sanctuary for wealth, a strategic pivot point. Whoever held Gwalior held their hand on the economic heart of the region. They could tax the flow of goods, offer safe storage for merchant caravans, or cut off a rival's commerce entirely. The hill fort, as perfected here, was more than a military installation. It was a bank, a customs office, a statement of power, all carved into a mountain. This idea of an inland stronghold governing the crossroads of commerce. It brings us back to the original network of crossroads, the Silk Road itself, and to a fortress so legendary, its name became a synonym for remote, impregnable power. The desert sun had baked the earth into this cracked plain, and on that plain a city of mud, Arg-e. It was the largest adobe structure on earth, a fortress of sun-dried bricks right on the southern Silk Road. But it was more than a military post. It was a whole urban world inside one massive wall. Inside those ramparts were homes, markets, bathhouses, the governor's palace, barracks. A complete city lived in there. Its wealth came from the loom. Bam was famous for textiles, fine cotton, silk brocade, made in workshops inside the walls. Those goods were loaded onto camels in the caravanserai, sent west to Baghdad or east to India. So the fortress wasn't just protecting people, it was protecting an industry. The whole economic cycle, from making to trading, happened under those battlements that created a symbiosis. The walls provided the safety for that valuable work. And the prosperity from the work paid for the soldiers for maintaining the walls. But how could a place like that survive a siege? In that arid landscape, an enemy could just surround it and wait for thirst. Bam's answer was underground, a Kanat system, a network of sloping tunnels dug deep to tap distant groundwater. These hidden channels brought a reliable, secret flow of water right into the citadel. To reservoirs, to courtyards, to the date palms growing inside. A besieging army would see a mud fortress under a brutal sun. They wouldn't know that below their feet, a cool, constant stream was sustaining the life within. That self-sufficiency was the real foundation. It meant the city could never be starved out. It could hold indefinitely. That knowledge was a deterrent. Why would any warlord waste months, years, camped in a desert, trying to siege a fortress that couldn't be broken by thirst? Arg-e was the ultimate city fortress. It wove defense directly into daily life and economic production. The community and its protective shell were the same thing. This model of integrated, self-sufficient security would be tested again somewhere else. Where the walls weren't made of mud but of cold, hard stone against the sea, the desert needed more than just one gate. It needed a series of safe places. A camel carrying a load can travel about 20 miles in a day. That distance, 20 miles, became the measure for safety. So every 20 miles or so, along the most empty parts of the road, you'd find a fortress. Just rising out of the dust, not a city, a refuge, like the Raboti Malik caravanserai in Uzbekistan. From far away, it looked like a square, low castle. Walls made of baked brick, no windows, one heavy gate. That was the only opening. You didn't just come across it. You had to aim for it. You'd be looking for it as the light was fading. And inside, that desert chaos was gone, replaced by a kind of order, a huge central courtyard, big enough for hundreds of camels, all their cargo. Around the edges, arched spaces for shade for storing goods. Stairs went up to a second level. That's where the merchants slept, in secure rooms. Guards had their barracks built right into the walls, and there were deep wells. Water there was more valuable than anything being carried. The whole place was its own little world, a self-contained system for trade and protection. For a price, a caravan leader could unload everything, silks, spices. It would all be locked behind that gate, with armed men watching all night. He could sleep. No fear of bandits. He could even trade right there in the yard with other merchants. So the caravanserai became a market that moved along the route. That was the idea, the genius of it. You don't build one wall across 1,000 miles of nothing. You build a network of strong points. Each caravanserai was like a stone bead on a string. Together they made a chain, a protective chain, so a caravan was never more than a day from walls, from water, from armed help. This system spread the cost of security. And it spread the benefit. It made long-distance trade possible, more than possible, predictable. These places, like Raboti Malik, they were like pumping stations. For the ancient economy, keeping commerce moving like a bloodstream along those continental arteries. And this model, this idea of a secure network, it finds an echo. Far to the southwest, in the sands of Arabia, where another empire used that same logic for a different desert, there's a tomb, just one. It comes straight out of the rock, completely alone. They call it Casa al-Farid, the lonely castle. But it isn't a castle, it's a tomb, a huge tomb carved from a single piece of sandstone out in the desert. In what's now Saudi Arabia, the front of it is unfinished, but you can see the work. The hand of Nabatean stonecutters is clear, and its isolation, that's the first clue. It wasn't built in Petra, in the busy center. It was built here on a barren part of the incense route. That was a statement. A deliberate one made in stone. The location was strategic. This area, Mada in Sale, was a southern hub for the Nabateans, a place with vital wells, smaller way stations. The tomb's presence changed it. It became a permanent landmark in a landscape that was always shifting, a sea of sand. For a caravan guide, seeing that shape on the horizon meant something. It meant you were on the right path. It meant water was near, a known stop was close. It meant you were under the eye of Nabatean authority, a symbolic watchfulness. It housed a burial, a final resting place, but for the living its function was more. An unfinished tomb, that scale, commissioned by someone important. It signaled a long-term investment. It said the Nabateans were here to stay, that this route belonged to them, to a potential raider. That lonely structure was a warning. It suggested patrols could be nearby. That this empty place was claimed and monitored. The psychological effect, it's hard to overstate. In a landscape with no reference points, a man-made mountain of stone projects' power. Permanence, it deters just by being there, by its audacity, and that shows a layer of route security, a subtle, brilliant one. Defense wasn't always walls and soldiers. Sometimes it was perception, creating a landscape of control. By putting these monumental tombs along their trade routes, by carving their style into the bedrock itself, the Nabateans engineered a sense of oversight. Across hundreds of miles, a caravan moving from one landmark to the next was moving through a protected corridor. Each tomb, each well, each small fort was like a bead on that chain. The same protective chain as the caravanserais, but here the beads were also advertisements of power and stability. They assured merchants this kingdom could protect its wealth and commemorate it monumentally. This soft power etched into desert cliffs worked with the hard power of Petra's defenses. It showed that securing a trade empire needed both the clenched fist and the guiding hand. And while the incense trade connected continents, another ancient network was being watched over by a different kind of sentinel. One that moved not on land but with the flow of a river. Water was the currency of the desert. An oasis like Al-Ula was a bank. It held the only wealth that mattered. It had this green heart, but it was surrounded by a fortress, a natural rock fortress. These sandstone canyons, these towering mesas, they formed a maze. And successive kingdoms saw it, the Lyhianites, then the Nabateans. They saw it for what it was, the ultimate strategic prize. So they didn't just build a wall around the springs and the palm groves. They carved their defense right into the landscape. They built settlements into the cliff faces. Their homes, their storerooms, they hollowed them out of the living rock. An attacker would have to scale sheer walls just to get to the front door. And the whole time, defenders could rain projectiles down from above. The whole oasis became a citadel. A multi-level citadel. It used elevation as a weapon. It used narrow passages as a weapon. This wasn't about repelling one army. It was about guaranteeing a function. Because every caravan on the incense route, after weeks in that brutal emptiness, depended on Al-Ula. Here, the camels could drink, merchants could restock. They could get dates, other food, repairs could be made. The oasis was a recharge station for the entire economic system. If it fell to a hostile force, the route died. The sweet smoke would stop flowing, so fortifying it was an investment in the network itself. Controlling Al-Ula meant you could tax the caravans that stopped. But it also meant you could turn the tap on or off. You could control transcontinental trade, and that reveals something, a fundamental truth. The most critical asset on a trade route wasn't the cargo. It was the support system, the wells, the caravanserais, the oases. You protect those nodes and you protect the flow of everything. That principle of securing the infrastructure over the individual shipment would be tested on a much larger scale. Not in the deserts of Arabia, but on the vast, open grasslands, where mobility itself was the greatest threat. The Black Sea could provide a lot. Its northern shores had a secret. The soil, there was some of the most fertile soil in the ancient world. Wheat grew in abundance, enough to feed entire cities far to the south, but that grain was useless if you couldn't ship it. And Chersonesos was the key, a Greek city built right on the tip of the Crimean Peninsula. Its location was a masterstroke of economic geography. It had two excellent harbors. Sheltered from the fierce storms, from here ships could be loaded with the harvest from the steppe. They could sail directly to Athens, to Constantinople, to any Mediterranean port that needed bread. This made Chersonesos a vital pump in a continental food chain, and that importance was written in stone. In its walls, the city was defined by them. Thick stone ramparts reinforced with towers at regular intervals. A fortified perimeter that stretched for miles. They didn't only face the sea, they turned inland toward the open grasslands. That was the real threat. The steppe was a source of wealth but also of danger. nomadic tribes like the Scythians saw the wealthy port as a permanent temptation. A raid could plunder treasure. It could also cripple the food supply of distant empires, so the walls of Chersonesos had to be a permanent answer, built to withstand a sudden cavalry charge, a prolonged siege. The towers gave defenders elevated platforms for artillery and archers, command over the flat approaches. Archaeology shows a story of relentless vigilance. The foundations show layers, a wall from the 5th century BCE, then a thicker one built in the 4th, then reinforcements in the Hellenistic period. Major upgrades under Roman and later Byzantine rule. Each new layer of stone was a response to a new threat, a more powerful siege engine, a shift in the balance of power on the steppe. The city's entire history is one of adaptive fortification. The economic role was so critical, the defenses had to evolve or die. This wasn't about protecting a palace or a temple. It was about protecting a pipeline of grain that sustained civilizations. Chersonesos makes a point about the geography of trade. A maritime hub needs a secure landward connection to function. Its prosperity depended on wheat from the hinterlands, but that hinterland was a wild, contested space. The walls were the necessary interface, the stable, solid line where the chaotic energy of the steppe met the orderly, mercantile world of the Mediterranean. They guaranteed the transfer could happen, that ships could be loaded in peace, that the essential commodity could flow. This same challenge would echo thousands of miles away, where another empire built not just a city wall but a wall across the landscape itself to accomplish the very same goal. The steppe was this silent tide, a wave of mounted warriors moving faster than any settled empire could. To stop it, you couldn't just build a fortress, you needed a line drawn in stone across the whole landscape. In northern Persia, the Sasanian Empire had this problem. Their farmlands, their cities, were a constant lure for the nomads to the north, so they built an answer. An answer so vast they called it the Red Snake, the Great Wall of Gorgon, a linear barrier on a scale that rivals the walls of China, for over 120 miles from the Caspian foothills into the mountains. A continuous rampart of fired brick, over 20 feet high and 30 feet thick at the base. But it wasn't just a wall, it was an integrated military system. Archaeologists have found over 30 forts along its length, spaced at regular intervals, each one garrisoned with troops who could respond to a breach. The real marvel, though, wasn't the bricks or the forts, it was the water. An army in that arid region would die of thirst, so the engineers solved it with a canal. A massive artificial waterway that ran parallel to the entire wall. This canal did more than quench thirst. It filled the defensive ditches, creating a moat. It powered mills. It allowed for local agriculture to support the garrison. It turned a barren frontier into a sustainable position. A soldier on this wall had a constant supply of fresh water. A revolutionary advantage. What was it protecting? The empire's agricultural core. The fertile plains south of the wall were the breadbasket of the Sasanian state. They also held key branches of the Silk Road, routes from the Caspian into the heart of Persia. The Red Snake defended an entire economic zone. It secured the fields that grew the grain, the roads that carried the silk, the stability that let an empire flourish. Its construction shows a strategic shift. Instead of fortifying points, you fortify the entire line of vulnerability. You create a filter. Peaceful trade and migration pass through controlled gates while the destructive raid is stopped. The sophistication here, the coordinated construction, the planning for water, the network of forts, it marks a high point. It shows ancient engineering thinking not in terms of battles, but in terms of permanent, systemic border control. But this concept, a linear barrier to secure a fertile plain, it isn't a Sasanian invention. Its roots are older, much older, lying in the very cradle of civilization. Herodotus described walls so wide you could have 2 chariots pass each other up there. That was Babylon. It was a statement in glazed brick and stone. Those walls weren't just a barrier, they were a stage, a platform for projecting power across the whole plain. The Ishtar Gate was the centerpiece, blue tiles, lions, dragons. But it was also a fortified entrance, a psychological weapon. Any trader coming up the Euphrates would see that gate. They'd see the walls stretching out on either side. The message was clear. This wasn't just a market, this was the heart of a world, a place of such strength that commerce here was guaranteed. It was safe. Inside those walls, Babylon thrived. The Euphrates flowed right through the city, a liquid highway. Barges carried grain from the north, dates from the south, textiles from workshops everywhere. The walls made that flow possible. They created a secure enclosure. Deals could be made there, goods could be stored, wealth could accumulate without fear of a raid. The city became a clearinghouse. Its famous code of laws wasn't just about justice. It was about creating a predictable environment for trade. Contracts could be enforced. Disputes settled. The monumental walls provided the physical safety. They let that legal system function. They were the prerequisite, the fortified shell that let the organism inside evolve. So Babylon sets a pattern. The first requirement for a major commercial center isn't a bank or a bazaar. It's an unbreakable perimeter. The confidence to build an economy, to attract wealth, begins with the belief that your treasures are untouchable. The walls of Babylon created that belief. They turned a city on a river into an idea of permanence, of invincibility. That idea would echo for millennia. Every merchant who passed through the Ishtar Gate carried it with them, spreading the legend of the city behind the impassable walls. This legacy, the monumental wall as the bedrock of commerce, would be inherited. Refined, pushed to new extremes by every empire that followed, it established a truth. Before you can control the trade routes of the world, you have to build a vault. A vault to keep your share of the wealth secure. The Hittites knew something about stone. Their capital, Hattusa, was built on the Anatolian plateau, but it wasn't really a city. It was more like a vault for a particular kind of treasure. The walls were made from nightmares, these huge blocks, some taller than a person. Irregular, massive, they fit them together without any mortar, dry stone construction. The result was a jagged, intimidating face. The weight of it, the way the stones interlocked, made the walls earthquake-proof. Made them impossible to tunnel under. This wasn't just building, it was a statement, permanent power carved right into the land, and the power it was protecting was metal. The Anatolian highlands were a crucial source. Iron and silver. Hattusa sat right in the middle of that like a spider. Its gates, like the Lion Gate with its stone guardians, they didn't just open into a city. They opened into the administrative heart of an empire built on mineral wealth. All the raw iron ore, every silver ingot from the hills, it all flowed through this secure hub. The Hittites didn't just dig metal. They mastered the technology to work it, and their capital's defenses guaranteed that knowledge, and the valuable goods stayed under their control. From Hattusa, they commanded the route south to Assyria, to Mesopotamia, and west toward the trading states of the Aegean. The fortress city's vitality was a direct reflection of those Bronze Age trade networks. Their health, for centuries the system held, the walls stood, the metals flowed. Hattusa thrived as a nerve center for commerce, for diplomacy. Then, quite suddenly, the networks failed. A cascade of events, what scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse. It swept across the eastern Mediterranean, invading groups, internal rebellions, a dramatic breakdown in long-distance trade. It severed the connections Hattusa depended on. The fortress, for all its physical strength, couldn't withstand an economic vacuum. A social vacuum. Its mighty walls were abandoned. Not because they were breached, but because the world they were built to engage with had vanished. The silent stones of Hattusa offer a lesson. A fortress isn't an isolated monument. It's an organ inside a larger body, the body of international exchange. When that body grows weak, even the strongest defensive heart will stop beating. That link between stone and commerce, between security and the health of the system, it would be tested again in a very different climate, where walls were built not to secure metal from mountains, but to guard a spiritual idea. As it traveled across the roof of the world, a fortress gate wasn't just an opening, it was a trap. Ancient military architects knew something. The best way to win a fight at your wall was to control it before it even got there. They didn't design for a fair fight, they designed for total advantage. That idea led to something, the kill zone, a space shaped by stone, a place where every disadvantage for an attacker got worse. And every advantage for a defender got better. It wasn't a doorway, it was a funnel, a narrowing corridor. It took a chaotic assault and compressed it. Made it into a slow, predictable column. Now put archers on the high walls of that corridor, put soldiers in towers overlooking it. A single arrow isn't aimed at a mass of men anymore. It's aimed into a channel packed with targets. The geometry does the work. That's enfilading fire, shooting along the length of an enemy formation, not facing it head-on. One volley from the side could pass through dozens of men. Ancient engineers built that possibility into stone. They thought in 3 dimensions. They used height and angle to turn a gatehouse into a slaughterhouse. You can see it in ruins everywhere. Take the approach to Derbent. Attackers from the north didn't face a simple gate. They were channeled between 2 massive parallel walls. A long, narrow corridor with death raining from both sides. At Gwalior, the path isn't straight. It forces sharp 90-degree turns. An army rounding a corner is exposed. It's disorganized, its momentum is broken, it's target practice for the defenders above. Even the winding sick into Petra, that's a natural kill zone. A geological version of the same idea. The goal was never to meet force with equal force. It was to make the cost of applying force catastrophically high. To make an assault so costly in lives and time that most enemies would just choose not to try. This engineering is a cold, logical calculus, a numbers game played with human lives. The architects were protecting something of immense value, the treasures, the trade routes, the whole economic system inside, so they designed to maximize defender efficiency and minimize attacker survival. Every bent entrance, every staggered gate, every murder hole in a ceiling, that was all part of the equation. They were creating controlled environments. Places where a few hundred defenders could hold off thousands, because in those choked passages, numbers became a liability. A vast army just meant a denser, slower target. This shared design language from Persia to India tells us something. These builders were solving the same problem. How do you use static stone to defeat mobile, overwhelming force? Their answer was to build not just a barrier but a machine for defense, where the very act of approaching the walls was the first and most deadly phase of the battle. The defense wasn't always up on the walls. Sometimes it was underground, a steady, quiet flow that decided who would last. Outside, attackers could be dying of thirst under the sun. Inside, the defenders might have a secret abundance. That was the power of water. Ancient engineers knew a fortress was only as strong as its weakest point. And in dry places, that point was always water, so they made water management a weapon. They didn't just build walls to keep people out. They built hidden landscapes to keep life going inside. Think of the Kanat systems like under Arg-e. These weren't just wells, they were masterworks. Workers would dig a mother well at the foot of a far-off mountain where the water was. Then they'd tunnel a gently sloping channel back toward the city for miles, and along the way, vertical shafts for air and for maintenance. The result was a gravity-fed aqueduct. hidden under the desert. An enemy army outside would see a dry plain. They wouldn't know a cool stream was flowing unseen into the fortress, filling its reservoirs, watering its palms. That invisible infrastructure made a siege pointless. The attackers would run out of supplies long before the defenders felt any strain. This idea of secured water was everywhere. At Masada, the desert fortress, they carved huge cisterns into the bedrock of the mesa top to catch rainwater, storing enough for 1,000 people for years. Petra's Nabateans built their whole city around controlling water. They lined the sick with channels to handle floods and carved cisterns into the cliffs. Their survival didn't depend on stopping every attack. It was about making the weight unbearable for any attacker. The message was clear: you can surround us, but you can't starve us. You can't parch us. Time, the siegemaster's ally, becomes his enemy. This water genius needed a complete view of design. A fortress wasn't just a military thing anymore. It was a life support system. Engineers had to calculate rainfall, groundwater flow, evaporation, storage. They had to protect the water from sabotage. From poison, a single poisoned well could doom a city faster than any battering ram. So the most important cisterns went in the most secure inner courtyards. Sometimes under temple floors, guarded like a treasury. The resilience this created had an economic purpose. A trade fortress that could survive a multi-year siege was a safe investment. Merchants knew that even in a conflict, their goods behind those walls were secure. The caravan trade could pause, wait out the storm, and start again right where it stopped. The hidden water network was the ultimate insurance. It guaranteed continuity. It turned a fortified point from a target into a permanent, reliable node in commerce. The silent water flowing in the dark under the stones was the true pulse of the fortress. It was the quiet confidence that let kingdoms project power across deserts. It reminds you that sometimes the greatest strength isn't what you show your enemy, it's what you keep secret and sustain. Stone had its own language. It didn't need words. A wall like the one at Great Zimbabwe, 30 feet of seamless granite, that wasn't just a barrier, it was a declaration. It spoke to the eyes, to the gut of anyone coming near. The message was primal. Look at what we can do. Look at the time we can spend. Look at the order we can impose. This was the psychology of scale, a silent, non-violent weapon. The goal wasn't only to stop an army. It was to make the idea of raising one seem absurd, to project such overwhelming permanence that conflict never started. Think of a caravan leader from the coast arriving inland. He sees those smooth, towering walls winding across the hill. He doesn't see soldiers first. He sees the impossible labor, the thousands of hands, the years of work, the absolute command of resources. In that moment, he isn't just looking at a stronghold. He's looking at the shadow of a state so powerful, so rooted it can move mountains. For him, a merchant whose life depends on predictability, that sight is reassuring. It promises stability. It promises agreements will be honored because the power behind them isn't going anywhere. The walls become a brand, a guarantee of security that encourages commerce, that attracts wealth because they make the place seem untouchable. This psychological effect was deliberate. The endless, serpentine ramparts of the Great Wall of China, vanishing over ridges into the haze, served the same purpose for the nomadic tribes of the north. The wall was a statement written across the landscape. It said the empire behind it was unified, vigilant, limitless. A raiding party might breach a section, but they could never conquer the idea. The sheer visual scale created a sense of futility. Why attack a frontier that is itself a monument to infinite patience and collective will? The wall worked best when it prevented a fight altogether, by making the cost of even attempting one feel psychologically unbearable. This non-violent aspect was perhaps its most sophisticated function. By building on a scale that inspired awe rather than just fear, these empires were engineering consent. They were shaping perceptions. For trading partners, the monumental walls signaled a safe, reliable node, a place where deals were secure because the power enforcing them was monumental. For potential adversaries, they signaled a catastrophic cost. The resources needed to build such things implied even greater resources available for war. It was a preemptive form of conflict resolution. The stone did the talking. Its vocabulary was one of overwhelming presence and timeless order. In the end, the most successful fortifications won the battle in the mind long before the first arrow was knocked. They turned physical mass into psychological mass. They made their own existence the ultimate deterrent, creating stable, predictable environments where silk could be weighed, spices bargained for, ideas could flow. The silent intimidation of scale was the unseen guardian of trade, a peace forged not from treaties, but from the profound, wordless impact of engineered stone. The landscape was the first line of defense. These engineers understood something. Their greatest ally wasn't more stone, but the stone already there. The natural world had obstacles, but to them, those obstacles were gifts. A cliff wasn't a barrier, it was a rampart already hundreds of feet high. A river wasn't a problem. It was a moat already flowing. A desert wasn't an empty wasteland. It was a killing field, waterless, that would cripple an army. The genius was in seeing that potential. In not fighting the terrain but recruiting it. You see it in the examples. Derbent didn't just build a wall. It stitched the Caucasus Mountains to the Caspian Sea, turning the whole range into an extension. At Tyre, they didn't see an island as isolation. They saw a natural moat, and then they built those seawalls to enhance it. In Al-Ula, they didn't build a fortress on the plain. They carved their homes and defenses right into the cliff, turning the mesa itself into a stronghold. Petra's entire existence relied on the sick, that natural corridor, so perfect no engineer could have designed it better. In each case, the planners asked one question: what does this place already give us? And then they built to amplify that. This was brutal practicality. Hauling millions of stone blocks across flat land was a monumental expense, but using an existing cliff face, that saved countless man-years of work. Why dig a moat when a river already flows in the right place? Why build a tall watchtower when a hill gives you the view for free? It minimized cost. It let kingdoms build formidable defenses faster with fewer resources, but the benefits went beyond economics. A wall built into a mountain is stronger than a freestanding one. It has the bedrock as a foundation. A fortress carved from a cliff draws its strength from the geology of the whole region. This integration created structures that weren't just placed on the land, but were of the land. They were sustainable because they worked with the environment's own logic. This reveals a deeper understanding. These weren't conquerors imposing their will on the earth. They were strategists in a dialogue with it. They listened to the language of the topography, the narrow pass, the high plateau, the defensible island, and they responded in stone. They turned environmental challenges into advantages. The desert's aridity, which could kill a garrison, became a weapon against besiegers. The mountain's impassability became an impassable wall. The sea's unpredictability became a shield. That's the thread connecting all these fortifications. From the Maya earthworks to the Renaissance bastions, the core idea remained. Don't just build a defense, build a collaboration. Let the world around you do the heavy lifting, and in doing that, they achieved something timeless. They created defenses that felt inevitable, as if they'd grown from the soil itself, standing as permanent guardians. These 30 stone sentinels, when you see them together, they form a pattern. A global network, a strategy. They weren't isolated monuments, they were points on a single map, a sprawling map of human ambition. And each one, from the desert gates to the jungle earthworks, it represents a calculation. A universal calculation, the cost of prosperity. They were economic policy made physical. written not on parchment but in ramparts and moats, an empire's budget, its deepest anxieties, its grandest aspirations, all converted into masonry. That was the price of doing business on an imperial scale. Before you could tax a bale of silk, before you could price an ounce of pepper, you first had to build the vault. You had to invest in stone, and that investment, it shaped everything. The legacy isn't just in the ruins we visit, it's in the architecture of history itself. They were the decisive factor. They decided which cities would thrive as secure hubs and which would fade. They decided which empires could project power along 1,000 miles of road and which would be confined by their own vulnerability. And most profoundly, they controlled which cultures would connect, the intellectual exchange between Persia and India, the technological transfer from China to Rome. The artistic fusion in Samarkand, none of it was an accident. It was a direct consequence of security. These brutal, beautiful bastions made the world just stable enough. Stable enough for ideas to travel alongside the spices. They created the protected spaces, where a merchant could also be a philosopher, where a caravan could carry a new religion. Their collective story, it converges on a truth. Trade built the world. It was the engine of civilization, the spark for exploration, the reason for contact. But fortifications made it safe enough to build upon. They provided the necessary stability for that engine to run. They turned chaotic, dangerous exchange into a reliable system. A system that could accumulate knowledge, that could foster trust across continents, that could allow something as fragile as a shared idea to survive a journey of months. The silent stones held back the chaos so commerce could flow, and everything it carried. This perspective, it gives us a 31st vantage point. Not looking at any one fortress, but at the interconnected web they formed. It reveals a world where military engineering and economic genius were inseparable. Where the thickness of a wall was a direct measure of the value it protected. Where the greatest human achievements, our art, our science, our connected cultures, they often relied on a foundation. A foundation of formidable, unyielding stone. So the next time you see an ancient trade route on a map, don't just see a line. See the chain of strongholds that made that line possible. See the sentinels that stood watch, not over kingdoms, but over the future itself. It started with a simple truth. Trade needed security, and security demanded a kind of genius. These 30 fortresses, they aren't just random ruins. They're one sprawling answer to a problem, the oldest problem. How do you protect a flow, that fragile, vital flow that connects everything? Every wall, every tower, every hidden cistern was part of that answer, part of a global puzzle, a puzzle of power. They were never just military obstacles. They were keystones, the foundation of entire economic systems. They were the confidence that let a merchant in Rome contract for silk from a weaver in Chang'an. The stability that let a Nabatean priest and a Greek philosopher meet in a Petra courtyard. These stones were the ultimate guarantors. They guaranteed that commerce could move. And all it carried across a dangerous world, the engineering we saw, the calculated horror of a kill zone, the genius of hidden water, the intimidation of sheer scale, the collaboration with the land itself. That was more than construction. It was a form of high art, a brutal, beautiful art of survival, applied intelligence on a monumental scale, solving for thirst, for momentum, for fear. Turning geography into a weapon, scarcity into a shield, and that legacy, that problem-solving, it echoes far beyond their crumbled walls. It lives in the logic we use today. To secure value, think of our trade routes now. They aren't trails of dust or lanes of salt water. They're streams of light, data, flowing through cables under the oceans. And what guards them? Not walls of stone, but walls of code. Not moats of water, but encryption. Not gatehouses, but firewalls. The imperative is the same. Protect the flow, secure the node, deter the raider. The language changed from masonry to mathematics. but the conversation continues, the ancient conversation between commerce and security. We still build fortresses, we just call them servers. We still defend trade routes, we just call them networks. It brings the story full circle, from a tamped Earth rampart guarding an oasis to a cybersecurity protocol shielding a transaction. That's the journey marked by this endless, innovative pursuit, the pursuit of safe passage. These stones stand as testimony, permanent testimony. They remind us. Our greatest structures are often born from a need to connect, to exchange, to trust across a distance. So hold onto that image, not of one wall, but of the web they formed. A web of security that once cradled the infancy of global exchange.